What has been the most heartbreaking thing you've personally witnessed? Today, while at work, library, a man came in and one of our regular patrons, a teen who's probably 15 or 16, came running up to him and gave him a hug. Turns out, the man is the teen's father. Now, through 2 years of seeing this kid almost every day, I know a few things about him. He's in foster care, his mom OD'd last year, he grew up on the streets, he was abused by several of his mom's boyfriends. So I was surprised to see he had a dad, honestly. But it became quickly apparent, to everyone else, that the dad wasn't that into seeing his son. But the boy could not see that. He was talking all about his life, his group home, his younger brothers, etc. Then he says, "Why don't we go to lunch? Let's go to Wendy's, right across the street." The dad goes, "Sure, let me go get my wallet, I'll be right back," and he walks out the door and doesn't come back. At all. This kid stood in the middle of the library for like an hour, then went back and forth between us and Wendy's for the rest of the day. A co-worker and I ended up sitting in the parking lot with this kid for like 2 hours after we closed, just letting him cry. This is a teenager who has seen and experienced the very worst things, many of them probably at the hands of his father, and yet he wanted so desperately to be part of his life. I've literally never felt so gutted in my life. All I want to do is tell this story to Liam Neeson, see the rage simmer, and then set him loose on this scumbag. 2 of my friends in college were high school sweethearts. Due to freak heart malfunction, the guy suddenly died while we were sledding my sophomore year. The girl remained close with his family, still calling his parents mom and dad. 10 years later, she was finally getting married to a new guy, but invited her high school sweetheart's parents as they are still close. The parents sat in the back row, and the father shook with sobs as he watched the wedding that should have been his son's. I feel horrible for taking any of my relationships even the slightest bit for granted. Shirt, okay here, shows my age, but as the cool kids say, whatever. Back in about 1992, I was walking to a friend's place, when with no tire scream, there's a horrific car crash. I ran over to see a car had T-barred another at a roundabout. Canberra is full of them. Seeing as it was about 1 AM, and at the time this being nothing more than a sleepy hollow, a few people came out to investigate. At this point, my St. John's training kicked in and I told someone to go call an ambulance. The situation is thus: the driver who rammed the other car smells like a brewery and is dead. He's also the driver who caused the accident by pushing through the roundabout. I get to the other car, and there's a girl. She's pretty messed up. The steering column has punctured her in the chest. There's blood everywhere. There are no crumple zones, so her own car is smooshed against her. I tell her that I know first aid, and that I'm not trying to grope her as a joke, trying to figure out the extent of her injuries. But I can feel all her ribs on her left side ducked up, and even at the lightest touch, she's hurting. So I start talking to her, saying everything's alright. Well, it's not, but the ambulance is coming, and start making shirty jokes at her to keep her awake. Then I hear the ambulance in the distance, and tell her she's gonna be alright. She looks me in the eye, and says, "Why didn't I meet you earlier?" and dies. Turns out, 30 seconds can be an eternity. My mother died in July 2009 from a massive heart attack. She was in the hospital for a few months because of many health issues and her cancer had come back. I remember laying on the couch the morning she passed, because I had fallen asleep the night before, and kept hearing the phone ring. In my half-asleep stupor, I just went upstairs. I remember thinking as I got into bed, wouldn't it be weird if it were the hospital calling? I laid in bed and just listened as the phone rang again. I thought my dad would pick it up because he had a phone in his room, but he was out cold. I finally got out of bed because I couldn't get back to sleep and answered it. Someone from the hospital was indeed calling and asked for my dad. I knew exactly what they were about to tell him. I just went upstairs, knocked on his door, and handed the phone over to him. I then went downstairs and sat with my brother, who had fallen asleep on the other couch, and I felt absolutely numb because I knew what news was coming. My father came downstairs and just said that my mother was gone, and we had to go to the hospital. My brother and I got dressed, and we all left to go pick up my older brother at his apartment. We just drove there in silence. We arrived, met a nurse, and they took us to her room. My little brother and I sat on the other side of the curtain because neither of us could bear to see the body. My older brother and father stepped around the curtain, and the nurse pulled the sheet from my mother's face. The next sound I heard was the most heart-wrenching as my father let out a soul-numbing scream and started crying. I could hear his heart breaking in that scream, which broke mine as well. To this day, it is the worst sound I have ever heard in my entire life, and I still hear it whenever I think of that day. Few things on the internet have brought me to tears. This was one of those few things. I'm sorry. I was driving down my street one day, and there was a dead bunny in the road. Right next to it, there was another bunny, just looking at the dead one. I had somewhere to be, so I couldn't stop. About 3 hours later, I'm coming home, and still, the bunny's looking at the dead one, in the exact same spot. I can't be sure, but I have a feeling he never moved. I went home and got some lettuce, then walked back to the bunny. I was sure he was going to bolt, but he stayed still. I sat down, gave him some lettuce, and talked to him. He ate the lettuce almost absent-mindedly, just staring at the dead bunny. You could almost see the sadness in this little guy's eyes. After about 10 minutes, I decided to give him some privacy. As I got up to go, I noticed, in the mess that was the dead bunny, were what looked like little baby bunnies. The poor thing had been pregnant. I cried as I walked home. The next day, the road people had gotten the dead bunny, and the guy I gave lettuce to had gone. Broke my heart. Oh God, why the duck did I open this thread? I've walked the same 40-minute route to work for about 5 years now. Every day I passed the same old guy and his German Shepherd walking beside him with no lead, carrying an old battered tennis ball. I figured he went to the corner shop for morning paper or whatever. Anyway, a few months ago there was no dog, and the guy was carrying the tennis ball, and has done ever since. My granddad crying as he kissed my mum's cheek and stroked her hair about 15 minutes after she had passed away. My mum was my grandparents' only child. To this day I have no idea how they have managed to carry on. My mother died from cancer in the hospital. Kidney cancer that had spread everywhere including her lungs. I was the only one with her when she finally let go. She slowly suffocated to death for endless weeks. I watched her final gasps that morning as they slowed in frequency until stopping completely. The only sound was the hissing of her oxygen mask, which I took off of her and shut the valve. I sat with her in silence for 15 minutes. Not moving. Not thinking. I wasn't a person in that moment, but a raw embodiment of grief. I was halfway through my stupid maple frosted donut. I put my hand on her and said, "It's okay, Mom. You rest now." Sitting beside her, I called everyone in the family, one by one, to tell them it was over. The worst calls were my 2 siblings, followed by my grandmother. I heard everyone's heart break that morning. Everyone's. I can't describe in words those sounds, but they still haunt me 11 years later. It was about 2 AM on a rainy Monday night, and I was driving home through empty suburbs in Sydney. Suddenly I turned into a smallish road and was blocked off by an ambulance. I was about to reverse and find another way when I see 2 paramedics bring out an old lady on the trolley, who was very much dead. These 3 were followed by a very old man, probably 80 plus, who followed behind trying to hold the woman's hand. He was bawling, falling over himself, getting soaked by the rain and shouting. He was shouting, "She's my soulmate. What do I do now? What am I supposed to do?" Something about an older proud man brought to their knees kills me. All the stories on this thread have made me really sad, but this one brought tears to my eyes. She was my soulmate. What am I supposed to do now? It's so desperate and horrible and lonely. When my grandma died, it was during open heart surgery. It was a 50-50 shot to repair not one, but all her valves, and she just didn't make it. At the funeral, as her husband of 60 plus years quakes at the side of her coffin, he blurts out, "The night before, in the hospital, I curled up into bed with her, It ducking wrecked me, and to this day I cry when I think of my grandparents sharing a single hospital bed on their last night on earth as a couple. He was so lost after she passed, he just didn't know what to do without her. I was 8 or 9, riding in the backseat of my dad's car on a really rainy day, heading home from my grandma's house. We passed this bus stop, which is right across the street from a McDonald's, and has a stoplight between the two. We're stopped at a red light next to this bus stop, and I'm watching this father and son trying to cross the street to get to the stop with their bag of McDonald's, in the heavy rain with no umbrella. The dad let the kid run ahead so he could get under the little shelter thingy, before our light turned and they wouldn't be able to cross safely. So the dad is stuck on the other side of the road as the cars start to move, and the poor guy gets hit with a tidal wave from a car passing him. Completely soaks his food to the point where the bottom of the bag fell out. I will never forget the look of defeat he had on his face, standing there soaking wet, having just lost his and his son's dinner. And then they still had to wait for the bus. I think that was the first time I ever empathized with someone I didn't know. I felt so terrible for him. Thank God. I kept thinking the dad would watch his son get hit by a car or vice versa. Still feel bad for him, though. One time when I was in the car with my mom, as she was turning the corner she screamed, slammed on the brakes, and pulled over. I was very confused and didn't realize what was happening. She jumped out of the car and ran into the street. That's when I saw what she had been freaking out about. The car in front of us had hit a baby bunny as it and its mom were crossing the street. The mom made it out but the baby didn't. The mom bunny had run back into the street and was trying to drag it to the side of the road as another car was coming from the other direction. My mom jumped out of the car and stopped the oncoming car. She brought the baby to the side of the road as the mom bunny watched from a safe distance. The baby wasn't dead yet but it was going to be. There was nothing we could do. She cried and I had to drive the rest of the way. As we drove away I saw the mother going back to the baby and still trying to help it get up.